Thank you. Oh. Thank you. And hello, good morning, afternoon, evening to wherever everybody is. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk to y'all today. My name is Nicole Davis. I am currently sort of striking out on my own. Previously, I ran the Institute for Creative Entrepreneurship at Berklee College of Music and the Open Music Initiative. And previous to that, I was a global liaison and program manager at the Clubhouse Network, which is where I had the pleasure of meeting some of y'all. So it's nice to see some familiar people, and it's nice to meet some new people. Lynn had asked me if I wanted to do a session, and I was like, I just was like, yeah, of course, talk about something. And in my past work, I have got really interested. I didn't really know that I was going to do this, but after the Clubhouse, I became really involved with the music industry and sort of fell in love with that. And I've always been a music fan, and, loved like the liner notes and, just being like a super fan and getting to know like all the ins and outs of like who sang on whose album and, sort of like whose vocals that was in the back of like that other song and thinking about like all of those connections that might've happened in the studio. But I didn't really understand like how music was made and how all of the, payments and bureaucracy and all of that with the music industry. So I became really involved with that since I left the network. And the other piece of the other sort of field that I started learning more about was blockchain. I'm going to talk about sort of why those two things interact and sort of how they interact. When I left my position in December at Berklee, it sort of coincided with this like explosive wave. I'm sure many of us remember within the United States and with, even beyond sort of the GameStop craze back in January, and everybody was talking about GameStop, and there was, those crazy waves. And sort of after that came this explosion of NFTs. So I was already talking to people about blockchain and NFTs and crypto and was really interested in it. And I had more time on my hands. So I was participating in some like cohorts and learning groups and book clubs and this and that. Since January, this space has sort of exploded. And I think and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think we're seeing sort of the hype cycle or the wave diminishing a little bit. But it's been really crazy to be in this space and have all of this time on my hands at this time when everybody, it seems like, at least in my network, is talking about it. But this is something that I've been, learning about and reading about and talking to others about for the last 5 or 6 years. And so having said all of that, ultimately the reason why I get really excited about this and why I was excited to talk to you all about it was because I think that I get excited about technology because of sort of like what it can do and for whom it can do that. And so I'm not as much like a sort of a tech for tech's sake, but more, tech as an empowerment tool. And so that's what I pitched to Lynn. And she fortunately said yes after a little coaxing from Jeff. He was like, yeah, definitely. Everybody's talking about NFTs. Let's do it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I've got some slides and I'm going to talk about like what Web3 is, what an NFT is, like yada, yada, yada. If you've been hearing those words, why it matters, I think, to the Clubhouse community and Clubhouse youth and to you all. And then, more importantly, I kind of want to just leave some space at the end to open up for like questions and discussion. And if I'm going along and something doesn't make sense, I know there's like translation happening as well. And I'm going to try to, not like go turbo speed and lots of slang. Anyways, as the session's going along, if I glaze over something or if you have a question, raise your hand and I can definitely slow down or re-explain something. All right, so let me share my screen. And all right, here we go. Hopefully this just stays cool. If my computer starts giving me trouble, then I'm going to stop my video because sometimes my computer doesn't like multitasking. So beyond the hype, that's kind of what I want to talk about today: NFTs, social tokens, and Web3 as empowerment tools. So first, let's just kind of level set with some terms, because the term Web3 is being thrown around a bit more. However, most of us don't sort of talk about what we use and the way we interact with the internet in terms of Web 1, Web 2, Web 3. So Web 1, for most of you, as long as you're not too young, y'all remember like when the internet first came, and you probably remember like somebody showing you a website and you were like, what? And like the dial-up tone sound, and you would like see a website, and it was basically there's a term skeuomorphic, and skeuomorphic basically just means that you've taken something sort of like analog and you've almost just kind of transposed it digitally. So like one of the best examples is the Notepad app, and the way it used to work on the iPhone, and it looked like a notepad, except that like you're typing, so you don't need the lines. And so Web 1 was very skeuomorphic in that they had taken like a magazine and basically just put it online. You could access information digitally, and that was massive. That was a big deal, but it was static. You couldn't do anything with it. It didn't like move, it didn't adapt. It was just text on a screen. It was read only. You couldn't contribute your own content. You basically had to be like a programmer or technologist in order to do that, which obviously some of you are, but for the sort of general user, it wasn't accessible. It was non-interactive. You know, you couldn't like something, you couldn't post a comment. It was siloed and centralized. And so what I mean there is that the information was hosted, and in those times, like you kind of had to have your own server. You know, I don't know if we remember that, but like a lot of times like you actually like had a machine that had the information from your website in your house, and that was what would get then sort of like transmitted to other people. And it was really sites. We didn't even really have platforms. I mean, there was like AOL and I don't know, like Prodigy or some of those other ones, but like for the most part, we were talking about sites. I think the chat rooms were probably our first introduction. So to Web 2. And so Web 2 is most of what we do now. Users can digitally access, interact with, and contribute information. So when we think of like Instagram, Tumblr, Facebook, YouTube, et cetera, Etsy, Patreon, all of these websites that are, this final bullet here, they're platforms. They're places where the information lives. So you no longer are storing that information, but they're dynamic. You can interact with them. They, do different things. We're kind of used to, they're not flat. They're no longer skeuomorphic, meaning that like, you would never like open up a book and have what you find in TikTok in a book. Like they're definitely made to be digital. You can read and write, meaning that like you can, we can all have a Facebook profile where we put information. Most of us, I'm sure, remember MySpace and like the customization, and you could do the colors and the videos and all of that. And yet they are still siloed and centralized, even more so because, where we were at sort of in Web 1, where there weren't a lot of places to like host your stuff. So like if I have a website, for example, the domain is hosted by Google Domains, and the content was made, designed and hosted on Webflow. I used Webflow, but there's like WordPress, Squarespace, et cetera. And so And I think like a better example of this siloed, centralized sort of infrastructure is is Instagram. So if you are in media, if you cook, if you're a podcaster, if you do makeup, if you are a musician, if you're a dancer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you are probably on Instagram. And metrics and success are measured through following and likes and shares and engagement and audiences. And anybody who remembers MySpace, especially any musicians that were on MySpace, when MySpace went down, your audience went with it, your followers went with it. Any relationships, like if random Joe Schmo found you on MySpace and liked your music, when MySpace went down, you can't find Joe Schmo. You don't know their email. You don't know how to get in touch with them. You don't know if they're going to necessarily come with you to the next platform. And so you did not own those audiences. And so when we talk about siloed and centralized, not only is like the data, your content, so when we put our photographs up on Instagram, those become property of Facebook, which owns Instagram. So not only is your content siloed and centralized, meaning that it's held by this, one closed, opaque, privately owned company, or it's publicly owned, but like, for-profit private company. But so too is your audience and your relationships. And we've gotten pretty used to that. That's kind of just, on some level, it's like, well, what else might there be? Like, really, like, what else would you do? Like, what's the other option? And so Web3 can mean a lot of things. But it's kind of this post Web2. So users can digitally access, interact with, contribute, control, and move information. And so we're thinking in a much less static way. And it's not just that the content is dynamic, but we're starting to look at like the metaverse. And I think what's really exciting about talking about some of this is that a lot of these topics and concepts are things that the Clubhouse has been doing for decades, right? Like, I think that, designing those sort of metaversal spaces, meaning like the virtual sort of, there's the real world, and then there's the metaverse where you can go and like Second Life, if some of you did Second Life back in the day. Those are these metaversal sort of like virtual spaces, and you don't have to have a virtual reality headset. It's these sort of like alternate worlds where anything is possible. Web3 is getting much more into user-generated content. We do see a lot of user-generated content, obviously, in Web2. So Lil Nas X, or like all of the YouTube covers and stuff like that. There's a lot of remixing happening. Web3 is certainly more suited for cooperation and collaboration. And then these two final points are important: distributed and decentralized. Meaning that the photographs or the content that you're putting out are no longer centrally held by an opaque private for-profit corporation. They can be distributed, meaning that they're held in multiple servers that might be sort of cooperatively run, and they're decentralized, meaning again that the ownership is not sort of this one entity or company. And then finally, we're moving from platforms to protocols. And what I mean by that is that rather than a platform sort of owning your stuff and everything lives there. So then when MySpace goes down, like your relationships, your audiences, your connections, your data, the same with like SoundCloud. So many artists have all of their content, and they actually just use SoundCloud as like storage to keep their mixes and their music and their demos. When SoundCloud goes down, like, so too does all of the information. Like, they don't care. I mean, I do believe that a lot of people, and I know people that work at SoundCloud, do care about artists, but like as a corporation, they go down, and so goes your stuff. So blockchain. I'm not a finance person, and I'm not going to give like a financial history. But what I will say is that during the financial crisis of 2008, when there were these massive banks that made some pretty, large purposeful mistakes, what we saw was that, big banks were bailed out in the United States by the United States government, deemed too big to fail. And yet, thousands of regular people in the United States lost money because of predatory lending and, like opaque and sort of purposefully difficult to understand mortgage terms. And with that, trust in the banking system and the finance system became really eroded, and people were very upset. So this anonymous person who calls themselves Satoshi Nakamoto wrote a paper. And in that paper, he basically said, what are the alternatives to what we've got going on with the financial system? What are there other ways to bank and to move money and connect money? I don't know if there's anyone from Latin America in the group, but anybody who is familiar with Argentina or Venezuela, financial depreciation and basically the government sort of overnight making massive decisions about the value of your money and then whether you have access to your money is something that people in a lot of countries outside of the United States are very familiar with. And there's I can share this somehow. Hi, Brian.
Hi.
I can share this as a resource. Oh, please go ahead.
No, just wanted to say that I'm from Argentina, and I know what you're talking about.
I'm sure you know much better than I do. So there's a technologist, his name is Mariano Conti, I think, and he wrote an essay basically about why he uses cryptocurrency, because I believe he's Argentinian, and talking about sort of the desire to be paid in a currency that wasn't going to depreciate overnight, and basically, that couldn't overnight basically just be worth nothing, or have limits on how much of it you can spend or how much of it you can move from country to country. And so these are, real limitations that exist that we are not perhaps as familiar with in the United States, but we did see this pretty massive failing on the part of the United States government back in 2008, and with ripple effects across the world. And so this white paper basically said, what if we didn't have to depend on banks to serve as trust agents between individuals? So like if I want to send money to Jeff for services that he is doing, and he's going to help me with some video stuff. And so I say, all right, Jeff, I'm going to send you $100. You send me a video. And we both know each other. And so there's trust. But say we don't know each other. That's where Etsy and eBay and banks and credit card companies and all of those basically say, well, here we are. We can serve as the trust agents. We will be the intermediary. We will be the middlemen, so that these two anonymous parties can interact and have trust between each other. And through a bunch of cryptography that I am not going to explain, and don't fully understand. I'm not a mathematician, but there are these mathematical problems that are sufficiently difficult that you need computer power to solve them. And by doing that, you basically make it more difficult to solve them than it would be to sort of do counterfeit or sort of make counterfeit transactions. And so through these processes, anonymous computers contribute and they store this information. And so there's, you could have a server with information in your own home. And there's, there are in fact hundreds and thousands of people around the world that host these blockchains. And so we went from having
5, 4, 8.
Oh, Troy, there you go. So we went from having, information stored in a centralized way by these private platforms to basically communities of people who don't necessarily know each other, saying, can we work together and use technology to build trust between each other and store the information ourselves? And, information can be financial information, it can be health information, it can be, there's sort of no end to that, because all information has sort of been transmitted into ones and zeros. So here, and this is as I was saying, in Web 1 and 2, we had these centralized sites that served as trusted intermediaries. So our financial information, our health information, our social relationships with LinkedIn and Facebook, and how do you know it's somebody's birthday? You got to go on Facebook. Our cultural information, so the ability to follow a musician or see a dancer, we go on Spotify or TikTok, and then again, like LinkedIn and other professional services that act as, again, these trusted intermediaries. But let's not forget that they extract profit. So each of these intermediaries find a way to make it profitable for them to be in the middle. And so whether they are selling our data or whether they're charging a premium, none of these are free. And, what I think we've seen over the past few years is that we have questions about what they're doing with our data, and whether there's a better system. And so what I'm really encouraged about is this concept of Web3, where we have these decentralized nodes. Again, a node is basically just a server. It's a computer. There are certainly large server farms, and I will address environmental questions and concerns before the session is over, because I think that's really important. But there's these, decentralized nodes or computers that use cryptographic technology to validate trust and share data. It becomes accessible across the sites and platforms that we want to use, but it is not stored there. So this could mean, again, the same type of data: financial, health, social, cultural, professional. And we're going to talk about platforms versus protocols. And so profit and data can flow directly from creator to consumer, because there's no rent seeker, middleman, or intermediary in between. I'm going to pause there because I feel like that was really heavy, and we're going to get to the more fun stuff. Questions? Reactions? Anything? I don't want to take a ton of time, but how are we doing?
I'll jump in. So really interesting, really informational stuff. I've heard a little bit here and there about cryptocurrency. There's actually a really great, I'm trying to think of which podcast it was, but they did an entire thing on how it's made, and the process of it being started. And it's all these different people in hotel rooms and stuff like that that are starting blockchain. It's really interesting. So this is just a really interesting additional layer to that. And I think just how it influences art, but then also politics. It's just a really fascinating topic. So I'm really enjoying it so far.
That's helpful. Thank you. Anything that's, let's see, there's something in the chat. Great. Thank you, Corey. Yeah. Yes. I mean, let's talk about that. That's, that is why I'm here. I hear you. It's, I think that what's exciting is that it is still very new. I know that there's a lot of FOMO, and I will share more resources for sure. I know there's, been a lot of FOMO as far as oh, I gotta mint an NFT or get into this right now, because everybody's making millions and but stuff is still super, super new. And this is still a really, really new space, which is, I mean, they have to invite me back, but I told Lynn and Jeff that I'd be happy to come back next year and talk about this again. And I don't know where stuff is going to be. I don't, I would have never guessed that we would be here. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about is that if this is something that is interesting to you, then you can help shape it as much as anybody else can. And I hope we need more people like you all. We need more creatives and more youth workers and more community workers involved in this world. Because I think, what I did not put in my slides, but probably should have, is that Web 1 and 2, as we know, were largely formed by white, cis, wealthy men. And I think that, we see, I'm reading a great book right now called Race After Technology, and there's so many great people like doing this work. But what we've seen is that like a lot of the problems that we see playing out are happening because the tech was designed for one specific type of person. And it benefits, it continues to benefit, and it was made to benefit those specific people. And so, in the time since I left my job in December, I've been thinking a lot about like, okay, well, this is something I'm really passionate about. How do we build this in a more inclusive way? So here we are. Why does this matter for artists and creatives? So I think I mentioned that my lens over the last 5 years or so has been very much music. And this certainly applies to many other fields, but I'm going to just kind of dive into music a little bit. I just want to say that I became an aunt again this morning. And so I'm getting pictures of my new niece as we speak. And oh my God, she's beautiful. She's got blonde. Look how cute she is. Oh my God. So adorable. Look at that chunky little face. Oh my goodness. All right. So I am so happy. She's like 2 weeks late. She's her own person. Okay. So why does this matter for artists and creatives? So the history of recorded music is a history of appropriation. So whether it's Big Mama Thornton's songs being sung by Elvis, even Bob Marley's music. I mean, everybody knows Bob Marley, but I Shot the Sheriff was really actually popularized and didn't get like heard as much until Eric Clapton covered it. Lee Scratch Perry, King Tubby, Bessie Smith, et cetera, like so many songs that we know, and so much of the roots of United States, American music, but also music that then really, we look at like K-pop and other like styles of music, sort of around the world, like have continued to be influenced by these traditions that have been appropriated and not credited and certainly not paid. And I would say that this is particularly true in the United States when we look at Black culture and Black music, but as I say here, rinse and repeat across mediums, and sort of across genres. And generally, and I guess the thing to note is that this is again very much true for Black, Indigenous, people of color, women in the music industry, in creative industries, but generally also true for musicians, period. So you look at songwriters, for example, they have been just consistently sort of left out of the equation, not credited correctly, not paid correctly. $424 million was just handed over by the streaming companies to this new organization called the Mechanical Licensing Collective. I'm not going to get into all sort of the intricacies of the music industry, but what I will say is that those streaming companies had been holding on to $424 million worth of songwriters' money in the United States that they had not turned over to songwriters because they couldn't figure out who the songwriters were, because they somehow can build a successful streaming business. I mean, this is Apple, this is Tidal, this is Amazon, this is YouTube, this is Spotify. They're brilliant enough to create these like technologies, but they couldn't find the songwriters. And this sort of like inability to track information and to even sort of be able to have this as an excuse is just kind of baffling. Platforms have basically been able to profit by pricing content to zero. So we've got on the left all of these different platforms. And then on the right, I started making a list, and I kept on just thinking of more and more, music, journalism, podcasting, dance, visual art, memes, writing, film, TV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, fashion, beauty. And I think that these are also, again, genres and art forms that have been, sort of rooted out of and come out of often Black culture or other races, and have then sort of been like popularized and appropriated. And so what we see here is just kind of this pattern over and over and over again, where people are creating content, they're creating movements that the platforms basically just then say, thank you, we will build our platform on that. We are going to profit from that, and you will be seeing none of the profits. But you should be happy because you're getting exposure, you're getting an audience, you're getting followership, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I would basically say is, to that is that this trust and transparency matter. Can you own your intellectual property? Can you own your audiences and fans? Is there transparency around royalties, attribution, meaning like, are you credited? Can you find out, it wasn't really until recently, and it's still not great, that you can find out who produced a song on Spotify, who engineered that song, who is the songwriter, who were the backup singers, who played, the guitar or like the backup horns on that song. Those people have basically, Spotify decided that information, and Apple, they all decided that information is not important. It used to be something that you could find in a record sleeve or a CD case. They decided it's not important anymore. And then discoverability, that goes back to it. Like, if you're a backup singer, will anybody know your name? Can they discover you? If they like the way that you sound, is your name anywhere that anybody can find? Figuring out and deciding how your music is distributed. Do you want it available everywhere, or do you want to have control over how it's distributed? And then what does the sustainability look like? Meaning, I was talking about like sort of when MySpace went down, what that meant for artists who had really sort of staked their career on their followership there. And then ditto sovereignty and autonomy. Do you have the control over your career, your livelihood as a creative, of how you're going to distribute your work, and sort of how that's going to live on even after the death of a platform? So I'm going to ask this question: what if you could connect directly? And so let's look at some of these technologies, and then I don't have a ton more. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what these things are. And I'm happy to share the slides afterwards, like especially as I have like some linked slides with some resources as well. So let's talk about connecting directly. I've sort of been talking about, and maybe before I get into this, maybe I'll pause for a sec, because I know I went really deep into the music industry sort of as an example, but let me pause for another second. I see a bunch of chat. I listened to that one. It was the ceremony was a cool one. But yeah, any other questions or comments on sort of where we're at? And thanks, everybody. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So thanks for this, by the way, Nicole. This is fascinating. The other thing I would want to say is with the amount of resources and my son's alarm.
He's a creator.
Yes. I need to turn that off. I'll pause on the question.
Anyone else?
I just wanted to say thanks for such an important point about crediting artists on albums and music. I'm a musician and artist, and still didn't make the connection that I couldn't find certain musicians or engineers or producers on albums, and have looked for them, but never, sort of zoomed out and thought about the implications of that. And then also how it sort of relates to, an artist like Kanye West, or some other people have done it too, where they drop the album credits as a separate piece of content. And I think that's interesting, but it's also not readily available all the time. So they're in a way of making it sort of an additional piece of content or event. It, sort of continues to privatize it or keep it opaque when, these people can't be found, and they have a lot to do with, what's produced. So it's a big shift just in the last, 10 years, 5-10 years.
Yeah, liner notes basically disappeared.
Right.
For sure. Jeff?
Yeah, so I wanted to know, my question was, so with the amount of resources that companies and governments have, is there any discussion about like getting ahead of what is the next step of companies and governments in relation to blockchains? Like we all know that they're not just going to sit idly by while this decentralization is going on. So is there like anticipation of, okay, well, if they do this, then we can anticipate that and we can do this or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And, I don't know how many people remember Facebook tried to actually launch its own currency called Libra. And like, what I will say is, and it didn't work because basically the SEC within the United States government was like, we don't want Facebook making their own currency. No, that's not, like, they shut it down. Not to get like sort of too like party political, but you see a lot of libertarians in the crypto space, and that is because they don't believe in government, and so they want sort of these systems that are sort of without and aside from government, and they want to have sort of control beyond government. And I think that personally, where I stand is that I think that it's really important for people to have what is the word I'm looking for? Agency. For people to have agency and sovereignty and autonomy, and for mutual aid networks, and for sort of person-to-person communities and networks to exist. I see that differently than sort of a libertarian, like every person Ayn Rand for themselves. And so governments, I think in particular, are very suspicious of cryptocurrency because they want everybody in their country to use their money, because that is a way to control and unite a people. And so, I think Venezuela, Iran, North Korea are perfect examples of that. So I think governments are very suspicious. Corporations, I think, are at this point trying to get ahead of the game and trying to, and are going to try to sort of control the sphere. And I think, again, like that's why this is really important for individuals to be involved, and for creatives and marginalized folks to be at the table and be making the tables. So time is getting away from us. I'm going to dive back in. So yeah, Jeff, I think it's happening. Governments and corporations, I think, are handling it in two very different ways for sort of obvious reasons. I think governments are suspicious and also like just famously not great at like technical innovation. If anybody's ever tried to like file for unemployment or access a vaccine website, like technology is not our government's strong suit. You should go to Taiwan if you want a technologically streamlined government. All right, so let's talk about what these things actually are. So blockchain, think of it as a database, but instead of one person holding it, it's copied on many computers, and those computers work together through very difficult math problems. So that's proof of, oh my gosh, not proof of stake, it's called proof of work, doing these math problems to sort of prove that they're all working together and that they all have the same information. Proof of stake just means that you have sort of a certain stake in the community but it's the same type of work where you're basically saying like, okay, we all have the same copy and we're all anonymously working together to store this information that we've decided is important. And so the information on those various systems can be tokens. So you can have basically this token, and we're going to talk about the two different kinds of tokens, but they represent this programmable relationship. And so if I hold, one token, so a token could be a Bitcoin on the Bitcoin blockchain. It could be a social token. So there are various, Portugal the Man, which is a band, has a social token. And so I could hold a Portugal the Man coin, and it would basically mean that I'm, sort of within that fan club. One of the best ways of describing this is Chuck E. Cheese. I know that Chuck E. Cheese is probably not global, so I know that not everybody knows Chuck E. Cheese, but when you go to Chuck E. Cheese, it's an arcade, like where you play video games. When you go in, you buy tickets. The tickets fuel the games. And then the games give you these coins that you can then spend in the Chuck E. Cheese store. And so both of those are these sort of currencies within the Chuck E. Cheese world, within the Chuck E. Cheese community, that everybody has decided are good for different things. And so that is what a token is. But imagine that token or that ticket was programmable. So it would say, okay, like Nicole is part of this community. It stands for this much, whatever worth inside this community. And it means that she has connections to these people. And it can also mean that she maybe has a certain status symbol within that community. That's not my personal favorite, but that does happen. Then there's these smart contracts, and they automate things through these programmable instructions. So a smart contract is basically an if this, then that. So I'm sure y'all are familiar with, like, when you're doing Scratch, like Scratch is the sort of the most basic, right? Like if you hit the green flag, then the cat goes, left 2 paces. So a smart contract is the same type of logic, where you're basically just saying, if you have this many tokens, then, you're part of this group. Or if this piece of information is sent, then give this person this many tokens. It's just a set of instructions, but it's programmable, and you can sort of interact and use tokens to start doing things between people or between entities. And then finally, the data is stored in this decentralized blockchain. I think what's most important here is that we look at the creativity leading the tech not leading the creativity. And so what do I mean by that? And Gustavo, Estonia, the country of Estonia is a very sort of crypto native government. And they're actually looking at putting a lot of their information or sort of already have. There's countries out there, Bermuda is another one. There are countries that are already, imagine like if you didn't have to go to the DMV and like my like identity and my social security was being used by somebody else. It's so analog. It's just like, it's maddening sometimes when you work with like government systems, how analog they are and how inefficient. All right, so let's talk about this, and then I'm going to wrap stuff up, and I want to hear from you all. Okay, so there's 2 types of tokens, and this is where we get to kind of like, what are these things actually? So an NFT stands for non-fungible token. My friend sent me, the funny, like, can it be a mushroom? It has nothing to do with mushrooms or fungus. Fungibility just means that something is the same as another. So if you have a banana, if there's like a pile of bananas, they're all yellow, they're all perfectly ripe. You don't care which banana somebody gives you. Bananas are fungible. Water is very fungible, right? A drop of water, you can't tell one piece of water from another. People are not fungible. So, if you have a child, you probably don't want somebody else's child. You want your child. And cars, again, like not really fungible. You want your car. So a fungible just means that it is sort of indistinguishable and exchangeable with any other item like it. So a Bitcoin is a fungible token, because if I have one Bitcoin, I don't care which Bitcoin I have. It's worth the same. It does the same thing. Non-fungible means that they are unique, and you want the one that you have because it is unique. It is not like any other. It cannot be exchanged with any other. You could certainly trade it, but it is not sort of, it's not like any other. So a non-fungible token simply means that there's some proof of connection between the token holder and that almost always digital asset. So some of the early ones were CryptoKitties and CryptoPunks. What was really cool about CryptoKitties and CryptoPunks is that they would then, you could marry them or like mate them, and they had like various attributes. So that one has like green hair and, you know, small ears, and you would mate it with somebody with like pink hair and big ears, and then you'd get somebody with like green and pink hair and, you know, whatever. And so they were these like individual assets, but very similar, like Cabbage Patch Kids or baseball cards, Pokemon, et cetera, where you have these like, you know, sort of unique assets that you could trade and interact. Digital art at this point is the sort of most common non-fungible token use case that we're seeing. A lot of GIFs, a lot of memes, but also just some really beautiful digital art. And I think this was initially where I was like, oh my gosh, like this is so perfect for the Clubhouse community, because this is so much of what Clubhouse youth create, probably even more so now that there's so much remote work happening. And so digital art now has a way of being shared, whether it's just like on a computer or in a metaverse. There's now digital art worlds where you can go to a digital art gallery and experience that in sort of this like, you know, virtual space. But, you know, the same as like, you know, one person or entity owns the Mona Lisa, but, you know, millions of people go see it. And it's the same thing. It's like, oh, I can copy paste this image. Yes, you can, but there is something to be said about being sort of the one proven owner of this piece that has a mark of authenticity. You know, it came from this artist because it was shown on a blockchain, and you know that the ownership was transferred to you. And so you are sort of the one person who has sponsored or supported that piece of work. Social tokens are different than non-fungible tokens because they are, you know, this kind of like ticket or token that is used. It can be used as a point of entry. So you get to go into a Discord community or a Telegram community or some sort of, you know, group chat because you own so many tokens for this or that community. It can be used to trigger different actions and activities. So, you know, you can access this concert, or you can, you know, play a game. I mean, I think like social tokens, think of like, what is it called? Vcash, Zcash? What is the Fortnite? I'm so like old and not hip. V-Bucks? Is that what they're called? Somebody who has a Fortnite gaming. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? What's it called?
V-Bucks.
V-Bucks. Okay, there. So V-Bucks are a perfect example of a social token because they're good within that world. You can use them for different things in that community. There's certain status or things that you can exchange them for, and they're within that community. They're not stored on a blockchain, but it's a really good example of like other ways that those social tokens work. And then finally, we're not going to have time to get into this, but one of the things that I think, and maybe this will be something that, this is my pitch. Lynn, are you on here? This is my submission for an annual conference session for 2022. We'll talk about Dows, decentralized autonomous organizations. So rather than governance happening through laws or through private corporations, imagine if some of this could be via instructions. And so people could vote or interact using blockchain technology. So instead of voting sort of in the ways that we do, where obviously there was massive problems with trust for all of the reasons that we know, you know, what if some of that was on a blockchain where you know, voting happened, for example. All right, so I'm going to leave you with these questions. Maybe I'll just put them in the chat and let's see if we have time to come back to them in discussion. The last thing I will say is, okay, so there's that. let me just speak to, and this could be a whole other hour-long session, but let me speak to the environmental piece really quickly, because it's incredibly important to me, to all of us, as human beings on this one planet. Blockchain technology is environmentally taxing. It does have a high carbon footprint. It has had a high carbon footprint from the beginning. One of the things I think is really interesting is that it really wasn't until artists got involved that people started attacking blockchain technology and taking notice about the high environmental impact. So people were using it over the summer for financial investing, and there was a huge explosion in what's called DeFi, or decentralized finance, of people basically doing like stock trading, but they were doing it with these tokens. And again, huge carbon footprint. Nobody was talking about it. It really wasn't until artists started getting involved and they said, oh, well, artists, should you really be involved in this thing that's so like tech people, finance people, sure, we expect you to destroy the environment, but like artists, what are y'all doing? I'm not saying that's an excuse. I think that what has been great is that in the last 3 months that artists have been involved, I have seen more and more of a push and a move to environmentally less or zero impactful blockchain technology. And so that is coming, and I think it has actually been accelerated by artists being involved. I personally, I'm not saying that this is right for everybody. I personally think that this is going to be a transformative technology, and I want for it to be environmentally neutral. And I think that it's only going to be that when people who are most impacted by global warming are, pushing it to be so. So that is my sort of like 1 minute, and I'm happy to talk more about that at a future date. But that is sort of my 1 minute response to that. The last thing I'll say is that the estimates of sort of what one NFT minting does to the environment is sort of taken in a vacuum. And so I would say it's not always like the most accurate as well. Okay, so I've got some resources here, which I will share. What I think is also cool. So this Hiset Nunc, which is a Latin phrase, I don't remember what it means, but this is a blockchain marketplace or an NFT marketplace that is actually using environmentally neutral technology. So marketplaces are starting to open up. Ethereum does have a large carbon footprint, but Tezos, which is a different blockchain, there are blockchains out there that are being developed with the explicit purpose of being environmentally not impactful. And then there's a bunch of links here. And again, like these are all linked, which does none of you any good right now, but I will make this available. And these are a couple people to follow. Serwa Tafwa is an Australian artist. Lady Phoenix is a sort of curator and community space holder. Trevor McFedries was the inventor of Lil Michaela, who is one of the first avatar non-human influencers. So she's a creative artist, but she's not a human. She's an avatar. And then Edgar Fabian Frias is, I think, I can speak to that, is another artist. And, I think that I hope, I need it here now. Thank you, Stephen. The carbon footprint with crypto is because the math problem is so difficult to solve. And that's the thing that sort of propels the trust. It's so difficult to solve that it takes an immense amount of computing power, which then obviously uses a lot of electricity. Increasingly, there's been more and more green power used for that, but that is why previously it's basically been so expensive to use all of that electricity that nobody would burn that much electricity just to do like a counterfeit transaction. So that is where sort of the trust and security of it came. How about I'm going to send the slides to Lynn or Jeff or somebody. Okay. All right, so I am going to stop. This is me. It's my Twitter handle, website, email, yada, yada. Questions?
Yeah, more of a statement and a question. So Yeah, you mentioned sort of the mindset. Yeah, I don't want to bring up politics either, but the mindset of someone who's investing or actively active in the crypto world. It's like, because if you talk about Bitcoin, they talk about how about 30% of it has been lost forever and it's gone and can't be brought back. So it's a very insecure, in a way, it's a big way, it's very insecure the way it's stored and the way people access it, because there's no outside agency to give that safety and security for it, like government or a bank, et cetera. But then on the other side is you have a full freedom in that risk you're taking, actively investing or being active in that community. So it's going to be a play at which one are you more comfortable with, the freedom and the risk, or the security and the stability of the value system. And that's going to be the question for moving forward with the online decentralized web or monetary system as well. So I guess the question is,
I mean, I think that the on-ramps right now to this tech are really steep, meaning that like you do, most of the people in this are technologists, and like I am actually not, like I'm not a coder, I'm not a programmer. And so the UX, the on-ramps, like all of the ways that you interface this, for the most part are not easy. And that's why people lose their keys, and they lose their Bitcoin. People are like, I had a Bitcoin, and it's like, well, it's worth $50,000 now. And they're like, I don't know what my password is, and I lost it. And like, it was worth, $5 when I got it. So it just seemed like play money. But I think that there's a lot of education that has to happen. But I think, again, like that's why folks like you are so important to be in this space, because you're educators, you're technologists, you're youth workers, and your community organizers. And I think that having non-tech bros and non-crypto bros leading the way is the way that this technology is going to be more inclusive. And so, yeah, right now, I have a friend, and I won't swear, but I have a friend who basically says, we'll know that blockchain has been successful when people stop saying the blankety blank word blockchain. And it's the same with websites. Like nobody says like, oh, wow, like the HTML that's behind this website, or like the protocols that allow, we just, the websites just work. And so I think that increasingly this technology will be successful because we're making it easily usable by young people and by our community members. So yeah, I think you're right. Right now it's difficult. It's easy for people to lose their keys, et cetera, but I think that's changing.
Nicole, I know we only have another minute or two. Thank you so much for this. It's been really great. I was just thinking about the implications of all of this for the Clubhouse Village, which, we're in the process of a major redesign. Well, we're actually coming to the tail end of that process. And I'm just thinking as we go forward, what some of the takeaways are from this.
So I think thank you. And I ran out of time a little bit there with the questions that I had pasted in, but I think that one thing, and you all have to decide what's right for your Clubhouse, but one thing I think that's really interesting would be a community token for the Clubhouse. And it's something that could be closed. So the word like liquidity is used, meaning that it has worth outside of the community. Your community token would not have to have any liquidity necessarily outside. It wouldn't have to like have a dollar exchange value, but you could use something like a social token in a community like the Clubhouse Village, which is somewhat of a metaverse, is somewhat of the sort of other third space where like you exchange and interact digitally, where you could tip other people's work, for example, with tokens. And find different ways for students to, or young people to connect with each other. And so I think like I know we're at time, I guess my last sort of like charge or thought that I'll leave you all with is, get to know the technology if it's something that you're interested in. You don't have to use it right now, but I think that, as you start to familiarize yourself with it, think about like, what are ways that you would like your young people to connect with others, or your young people to be able to put their work out into the world? And then are there ways that technology can do that? So rather than being like, oh, well, the one way that we use this is minting NFTs, and so our young people have to mint their work as an NFT and sell it on a blockchain. I guess what I would say is, what are ways that you want to distribute your work and that you want to connect between yourselves or between others? And are there ways for crypto to sort of enable you to do that? That's not Instagram and Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm happy to, to come back with a smaller group and maybe like workshop some of this, because I think that, again, stuff is so new that what's really exciting is that folks like you can impact how the technology is getting made. And so, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This was really fun.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you. This is great.
Thank you, Nicole. This is great.
Thank you.
you.
Good to see you all.
Thank
Enjoy the
you.
conference.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
Enjoy that new nephew.
Oh my God, she's in Seattle. Yeah, I've got to figure out how to get over there. Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
so much.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.